The Endless Night. Part 1. A city wrapped in darkness. Detective Alan Graves woke up to the same eerie darkness he had known for months. In the city of Everdark, the sun had not risen for over 90 days. People used to call it the City of Light because of its bright mornings and beautiful sunsets. But now it was a place of fear. The endless night brought something far worse than the dark. Shadowy creatures that roamed the streets. Alan sat on the edge of his small bed in his one-room apartment. The faint light of a flickering lamp was the only source of comfort. He rubbed his tired eyes and checked his clock. It was 9 a.m., but the world outside looked like midnight. The thick clouds that covered the sky let no light through. The streets were empty. No one dared to step outside unless they had to. Those who did often vanished without a trace. Alan put on his long brown coat, his badge clipped to his belt. He glanced at the small mirror by the door. His face looked older than his 35 years. Dark circles around his eyes showed how little he slept. But sleep was a luxury in Everdark. People rarely felt safe enough to close their eyes for long. He grabbed his flashlight and his gun. The flashlight was stronger than most, made to cut through the thick fog that rolled in during the endless nights. The gun, it gave him a sense of control, though he wasn't sure if bullets could stop the creatures. No one who had seen them lived long enough to explain what they were. The city was quiet when Alan stepped outside. His boots echoed on the empty sidewalk. Broken streetlights stood like ghosts, and abandoned cars lined the streets. The sound of the wind whispered through alleys, carrying a faint sense of dread. Everdark had once been alive with people rushing to work, children playing in parks, and couples enjoying late-night walks. Now it was like a graveyard. Alan's job had become much harder since the darkness began. He used to solve murders, thefts, and other crimes that made sense. Now he hunted shadows. Over the past month, more than 50 people had gone missing. Some said the creatures dragged them into the fog. Others believed something bigger was at work. Today, Alan had a new case. A family had vanished from their home in the middle of the night. The mother, father, and 2 children were gone. No signs of a struggle. No broken windows. The door was locked from the inside. He had to find out what happened. As he walked to the house, Alan felt a strange sense of being watched. He turned, shining his flashlight into the fog. Nothing was there, just the empty street. But the feeling didn't leave. It was as if the darkness itself had eyes. When he reached the house, he found the door slightly open. That wasn't in the report. He pulled out his gun and flashlight, stepping inside cautiously. The air was cold and damp, and the silence was heavy. The living room looked untouched. Toys lay scattered on the floor, and a family photo sat on the fireplace. Alan picked it up. The smiling faces of the couple and their 2 kids felt like a cruel joke in this lifeless home. He moved to the kitchen. A plate of food sat on the table, half-eaten, as if someone had been interrupted during dinner. The fridge was open, its dim light the only thing glowing in the room. Upstairs, he found the children's room. The beds were unmade, but the blankets were bunched up, as though the kids had been sleeping before they disappeared. Alan noticed something strange on the floor. A set of small, dark footprints leading to the window, but the window was closed and locked. He touched the glass. It was icy cold. In the parents' bedroom, he found a diary on the bedside table. Flipping through its pages, he saw the last entry. The shadows are closer now. I can feel them watching us. We can't run. We can't hide. If anyone finds this, we're sorry. Alan closed the diary, his stomach tightening. This wasn't the first time he had seen something like this. Families across the city had written similar warnings before disappearing. Suddenly, a faint noise broke the silence. A soft creak, like a floorboard shifting under weight. Alan spun around, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. "Who's there?" he called, his voice steady but tense. The only answer was the sound of wind outside. He took slow steps down the hallway, the beam of light shaking slightly in his hand. At the end of the hall was the attic door. It was slightly ajar, with a faint shadow moving behind it. Alan's heart raced as he pushed the door open. The attic was dark, except for his flashlight. Dust particles floated in the air, and the smell of mildew was strong. Then he saw it. Something moved in the corner. It was tall and thin, its shape barely human. The shadow seemed to ripple, as if it wasn't solid. Alan froze, his mind racing. He aimed his gun, but the creature didn't move closer. Instead, it pointed to the floor. Confused, Alan followed the direction and saw a trapdoor leading somewhere below. Before he could react, the shadow vanished into the darkness, leaving behind a chilling silence. Alan stood there for a long moment, staring at the trapdoor. Whatever was down there, he knew it wasn't going to be good. But he had to find out. He reached for the handle and pulled it open. The air from below was colder than anything he had felt before. It smelled of damp earth and something metallic. Alan pointed his flashlight into the dark hole, revealing a set of stone steps leading down into the unknown. Taking a deep breath, he started to descend. Alan moved down the stone steps, each one creaking under his weight. The cold air grew thicker as he descended, making it harder to breathe. His flashlight beam trembled in the dark, lighting only a small portion of the narrow passage. The deeper he went, the more the sounds of the world above faded. The wind outside, the occasional creak of the house. Everything was gone, replaced by a suffocating silence. The stairs led to a long underground tunnel, its walls damp with moisture. Strange symbols were carved into the stone, crude yet deliberate, as if someone had etched them in a hurry. Alan ran his fingers over one of the symbols, feeling the grooves. He didn't recognize the markings, but they seemed old, ancient even. A faint dripping sound echoed in the distance, breaking the silence. He wasn't sure if it was water or something else. The tunnel stretched ahead, disappearing into the darkness. Alan took slow, careful steps, his gun raised in one hand and his flashlight in the other. Every few steps, he would stop and listen. The sense of being watched was stronger now. It felt as though the shadows themselves were alive, shifting and twisting just beyond the edge of his light. As he moved deeper, he noticed the air smelled strange, metallic and sour, like rusted iron mixed with something rotting. The stench grew stronger with every step, forcing Alan to cover his nose with his sleeve. Then he heard it, a faint whisper. It wasn't clear or loud, just a soft, unintelligible murmur coming from the darkness ahead. Alan stopped, his pulse quickening. The whisper didn't sound human. It was guttural, like the voice of something struggling to form words. "Who's there?" Alan called out, his voice firm but edged with caution. The whisper stopped abruptly. For a moment, the tunnel was silent again. But then, a new sound emerged. A low, scraping noise, as if something heavy was being dragged along the stone floor. Alan tightened his grip on his flashlight, pointing it toward the sound. "Show yourself," he demanded, his voice echoing down the tunnel. The scraping grew louder, closer, until it stopped just outside the beam of his light. Alan took a cautious step forward, shining his flashlight into the dark. What he saw made him freeze. A figure stood at the edge of the light. It was barely human in shape, its body twisted and elongated. Its skin, or whatever covered it, was blacker than the shadows around it, absorbing the light rather than reflecting it. Its head was tilted to one side, and its eyes, if they were eyes, glowed faintly red, like embers in a dying fire. Alan took a step back, his finger hovering over the trigger of his gun. The creature didn't move, but it seemed to be watching him, studying him. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, without warning, the figure lunged toward him, its movements unnaturally fast. Alan fired his gun, the deafening sound echoing through the tunnel. The creature shrieked, a high-pitched, ear-splitting noise that made Alan's head throb. The bullet seemed to pass through it, hitting the wall behind. The creature recoiled, retreating into the darkness as quickly as it had appeared. Alan's hands shook as he lowered his gun. Whatever that thing was, bullets didn't seem to harm it. He wasn't sure if it was alive in the way he understood life. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, and pressed on, knowing he couldn't turn back now. The tunnel eventually opened into a wide chamber. The walls were lined with more of the strange symbols, glowing faintly with a bluish light. In the center of the chamber was a large stone altar, surrounded by a circle of candles that burned with an unnatural, cold flame. On the altar lay something covered in a thick, black cloth. Alan approached cautiously, his flashlight scanning the room for any sign of movement. As he neared the altar, he noticed more footprints on the ground. Small, like a child's, but smeared and uneven, as if whoever made them had been dragged. His heart sank. The missing children. Alan reached the altar and slowly pulled back the black cloth. Beneath it was a book, large and ancient, its cover made of a rough, leathery material. The pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with more of the strange symbols he had seen in the tunnel. In the center of the open page was a drawing of the creatures he had encountered, surrounded by a circle of symbols. Below the drawing were words written in an unfamiliar language, but one phrase stood out, written in shaky, uneven English. "They are watching. They are waiting." Alan's blood ran cold. The whispers returned, louder this time, echoing around the chamber. The candles flickered, their cold flames growing taller. The shadows along the walls began to move, slithering toward him like living things. Alan grabbed the book and stuffed it into his coat. As he turned to leave, the shadows converged, blocking the entrance to the tunnel. They rose like a wave, taking the shape of the creatures he had seen before. Their glowing red eyes burned into him, and their guttural whispers grew louder, forming a cacophony of incomprehensible voices. Alan backed away, his heart pounding. He raised his flashlight, the beam cutting through the nearest shadow. It shrieked and recoiled, but the others advanced, undeterred. Desperation took hold. He pointed his flashlight at the candles and, with a single shot, shattered one of the stone holders. The flame went out, and the creatures screeched in unison, their forms flickering like static on a broken TV. Taking the opportunity, Alan sprinted toward the tunnel. The shadows lashed out, trying to grab him, but he moved faster, his flashlight swinging wildly as he ran. The whispers followed him, growing fainter as he climbed the stairs and burst back into the house. He slammed the trapdoor shut and shoved a heavy table over it, his chest heaving with every breath. The house was silent again, but Alan knew he wasn't safe. The book in his coat felt heavy, as if it carried a weight far greater than its size. He had found answers, but they only raised more questions. What were those creatures? What did the book mean? And why had the city fallen into this endless night? Alan knew one thing for sure. Whatever he was up against, it wasn't finished with him yet. Alan sat in his dimly lit apartment, the ancient book sprawled out on his coffee table. The faint smell of old leather filled the room. The strange symbols stared back at him, taunting him with their mystery. He had managed to escape the shadows for now, but he could still feel their presence, lingering somewhere out there in the endless darkness of the city. Every so often, Alan glanced at his windows, half expecting to see glowing red eyes staring back at him. The city outside was eerily silent. Even though it had been hours since he'd left the house, the perpetual darkness made it impossible to tell what time it was. Time itself seemed to lose meaning in a place where the sun never rose. Alan's mind raced as he flipped through the brittle pages of the book, trying to make sense of the symbols and the scattered fragments of English. Some pages were filled with drawings of the shadow creatures, twisted, horrifying figures that looked like nightmares given form. Others depicted strange rituals, circles drawn in chalk, and strange candles like the ones he had seen in the underground chamber. Then, he found something that sent a chill through him. It was a map, crudely drawn but unmistakable. At its center was the city, surrounded by jagged lines and symbols. Scribbled across the top of the map in faint, faded handwriting were the words, "The barrier must not break." Alan traced the lines of the map with his finger, his heart pounding. The jagged lines seemed to form some sort of boundary, and beyond that boundary, the map was blank. What was the barrier? And why was it failing? A sudden knock at his door made him freeze. It was soft at first, almost hesitant, but then it grew louder and more insistent. Alan grabbed his gun and approached the door cautiously. "Who is it?" he called out, trying to keep his voice steady. There was no answer. The knocking stopped, replaced by silence. Alan waited, his heart hammering in his chest. He reached for the doorknob, his hand trembling, and opened it just a crack. The hallway outside was empty. But then, he noticed something lying on the floor. A small envelope, yellowed with age. He picked it up carefully and brought it inside, shutting and locking the door behind him. The envelope had no markings, no address, nothing to indicate where it had come from. Alan tore it open and pulled out a single piece of paper. Written in the same shaky handwriting as the book were the words, "They are already inside." Alan's breath caught. He turned around, his flashlight scanning the room. Everything looked the same, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. He moved slowly, his gun raised, checking every corner, every shadow. The apartment was small, just a living room, a bedroom, and a bathroom. He checked the bathroom first, pulling back the shower curtain. Nothing. Then the bedroom, opening the closet and peering under the bed. Nothing. But as he returned to the living room, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. A black, sticky substance was oozing out from beneath the coffee table. Pooling on the floor, Alan stepped closer. His flashlight focused on the strange liquid. It was thick and tar-like, and it seemed to pulse as if it were alive. Suddenly, the puddle expanded, stretching toward him like a living thing. Alan stumbled back, firing his gun. The sound was deafening in the small room, but the bullets had no effect. The black substance recoiled for a moment, then began to rise, forming a shape. A tall, humanoid figure with glowing red eyes. Alan ran toward the door, but before he could reach it, the figure lunged at him. Its shadowy arms stretched impossibly long, slamming the door shut. Alan turned and fired again, the bullets tearing through the creature but doing nothing to stop it. The shadow loomed over him, its guttural whispers filling the room. Alan grabbed the book from the coffee table and swung it at the creature out of sheer desperation. The creature let out an unearthly screech and recoiled, its form flickering like a dying flame. Alan didn't waste a second. He shoved the book into his bag and kicked the door open, sprinting down the hallway. The whispers followed him, growing louder and more frantic. As he reached the stairwell, the lights above him began to flicker. The shadows on the walls twisted and stretched, forming grotesque shapes that reached for him. He burst out onto the street, the cold air hitting him like a slap. The city was as empty as ever. The streets bathed in the same dim, unnatural glow from the streetlights. Alan didn't stop running. He needed to get somewhere safe, somewhere he could think. He turned down a narrow alley, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispers were still there, echoing in his ears. But now, they were joined by something else. A distant, rhythmic sound, like footsteps. Alan stopped, pressing himself against the wall. The footsteps grew louder, and he realized they weren't coming from a single person. It sounded like a group, moving in perfect unison. He peeked around the corner and saw them. A procession of figures, dressed in long, dark robes, their faces hidden beneath hoods. They carried torches that burned with a pale blue flame, casting eerie shadows on the walls. At the center of the procession was a large object draped in cloth, carried on a wooden platform by 4 of the figures. The procession moved silently, their footsteps the only sound in the still night. Alan's heart raced. Who were they, and what were they carrying? He waited until the procession had passed before following at a safe distance, keeping to the shadows. The robed figures moved with purpose, heading toward an old church at the edge of the city. Alan had passed the church before. It had been abandoned for years, its windows shattered and its doors chained shut. But now, the doors were wide open, and the robed figures filed inside. Alan crept closer, staying hidden behind a row of parked cars. He could hear faint chanting coming from inside the church, a low, monotonous hum that made his skin crawl. He waited until the last of the figures had entered before sneaking around to a side window. Peering inside, he saw the robed figures gathered around the object they had carried. The cloth had been removed, revealing a large, ornate mirror. The mirror's surface was dark, almost liquid, and it seemed to ripple as if something were moving within it. The chanting grew louder, and the mirror began to glow, casting an unnatural light across the room. Alan watched in horror as the shadows in the room came to life, rising from the walls and converging on the mirror. The robed figures stepped back, their chanting reaching a fever pitch. Suddenly, the mirror exploded with light, and a figure began to emerge from its surface. A tall, shadowy form with glowing red eyes. Alan recognized it immediately. It was the same creature he had encountered in the underground chamber. The robed figures knelt before it, their heads bowed. Alan knew he couldn't stay. He backed away from the window, his mind racing. Whatever was happening, it was bigger than he had imagined. The creatures weren't just shadows. They were something far worse, and the people in the robes were helping them. He had to find a way to stop it. But first, he needed to survive the night. Alan kept running, the heavy book thudding against his side as he clutched his bag. The image of the robed figures kneeling before the shadowy creature haunted his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that they had seen him, even though he knew he had been careful. The city's darkness seemed deeper now, as if the light from the street lamps was fading, and the shadows felt heavier, more alive. His every footstep echoed unnaturally in the empty streets, and the sound seemed to mock him, bouncing back from every corner. He ducked into another alley, trying to stay out of sight. The distant hum of chanting still echoed faintly in his ears, as if it were chasing him. Alan's mind raced with questions. What was that mirror? What were the creatures? And why were those people helping them? The book held answers, he was sure of it, but he didn't dare stop now to read it. He had to find somewhere safe, but safe didn't seem to exist in this city anymore. Suddenly, Alan heard the sound of footsteps behind him, not the synchronized march of the robed figures, but quick, frantic footsteps. He froze and turned his head, his hand already reaching for his gun. A figure emerged from the darkness. A woman, disheveled and out of breath. She stopped when she saw him, her wide eyes filled with terror. "Wait," she whispered urgently. "Please, don't shoot." Alan hesitated, lowering his gun slightly but keeping his grip firm. "Who are you?" he demanded. "Why are you following me?" "I'm not following you," she said, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "They're after me." Alan narrowed his eyes, his instincts screaming not to trust her. "Who's after you?" Before she could answer, a low growl echoed through the alley. Alan's blood ran cold. The woman's face paled, and she grabbed his arm. "We have to go. Now." Alan didn't argue. The growl grew louder, and he could hear the scrape of claws against pavement. He and the woman ran, their footsteps pounding in unison as they navigated the twisting maze of alleys. The growling followed them, accompanied by a strange, wet slithering sound that made Alan's stomach turn. He risked a glance over his shoulder and saw them. Shadow creatures, their forms shifting and rippling as they moved. Their glowing red eyes were fixed on him and the woman, and their mouths opened impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. Alan and the woman burst out of the alley onto a main street. For a moment, Alan thought they might have lost the creatures, but then he saw them emerging from the shadows, their forms growing larger and more menacing. The woman tugged his arm, pulling him toward an old subway entrance. The gate was rusted and barely hanging on its hinges, but it was open just wide enough for them to slip through. They descended the stairs, the air growing colder and staler with each step. The subway station was abandoned, its walls covered in graffiti and its floors littered with debris. The fluorescent lights flickered weakly, casting eerie shadows across the platform. Alan could still hear the creatures above, their growls echoing faintly through the tunnels. The woman collapsed onto a bench, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. Alan stood a few feet away, keeping his gun trained on the stairwell. "Start talking," he said. "Who are you, and what's going on?" "My name's Mara," she said between gasps. "I used to work at the observatory before all this started." "The observatory?" Alan frowned. "What does that have to do with anything?" Mara hesitated, her eyes darting around the station, as if she expected the shadows to come alive at any moment. We were studying an anomaly, she said finally. A strange distortion in the atmosphere. It wasn't like anything we'd ever seen before. And then one day it just opened. What opened? Alan pressed. A tear, Mara said, her voice trembling. A tear between worlds. We didn't know what it was at first, but then the shadows started coming through. They weren't just shadows. They were alive. And they were hungry. Alan's grip on his gun tightened. And the people in the robes? The ones in the church? They're part of a cult, Mara said. They call themselves the Keepers of the Dark. They believe the shadows are gods, and they're trying to bring more of them into our world. The mirror you saw, it's a gateway. They're using it to let the shadows through. Alan felt a sinking feeling in his chest. Why hasn't anyone stopped them? Mara laughed bitterly. Because most people don't even know what's happening. The city's in chaos. The sun's gone, the government's useless, and anyone who tries to fight back either disappears or ends up like them. She gestured toward the stairwell, where the faint sound of growling could still be heard. Alan sat down on the bench, his mind racing. The book, he said suddenly. This book I found, it has symbols, rituals. Is there something in it that can stop them? Mara's eyes widened when she saw the book. Where did you get that? An old man gave it to me, Alan said. Before the shadows got him. That's the Book of Veils, Mara said, her voice barely above a whisper. It's ancient. It's supposed to contain the knowledge to seal the tear, but it's written in a language almost no one can read. Alan opened the book and showed her the map. What about this? What does it mean? Mara studied the map, her brow furrowing. It's the barrier, she said. The one that's supposed to keep the shadows out. But look, she pointed to a section of the map where the jagged lines were broken. It's failing. That's why the shadows are getting stronger. So how do we fix it? Alan asked. I don't know, Mara admitted. But if the book has answers, we need to figure them out fast. The longer the barrier stays broken, the more shadows will come through. And once the tear is fully open, there'll be no stopping them. A loud crash from the stairwell made them both jump. The growling was louder now, accompanied by the sound of claws scraping against metal. Alan stood up, his gun raised. We're out of time. Mara grabbed the book and stuffed it into her bag. There's an old library near here, she said. If anyone can help us translate this, it's the Archivist there. But we'll have to make it past them first. Alan nodded, his jaw set. Let's move. They ran toward the subway tunnels, the shadows behind them growing darker and more menacing with every step. The subway tunnels stretched out before them like an endless maze of darkness. The weak glow from the flickering lights above barely illuminated the path ahead, and every sound seemed amplified in the stillness. Alan led the way, his gun in one hand and his flashlight in the other, its beam cutting through the thick shadows. Mara followed closely behind, clutching the book tightly to her chest as if it were her lifeline. Behind them, the growls and scraping claws echoed ominously. The creatures were still pursuing them, their hunger driving them forward. Alan's mind raced as he tried to keep his fear in check. The shadows seemed alive, curling and twisting in unnatural ways, and he couldn't help but feel that they were being watched by more than just the creatures chasing them. Mara whispered, her voice barely audible, "The library isn't far. It's connected to these tunnels, but we have to take the right turn. If we make a mistake, then we're done for," Alan finished grimly. "Just keep your eyes open and stay close." They came to a junction where the tunnel split into 3 paths. Alan hesitated, shining his flashlight down each one. The left path was completely dark, its ceiling collapsed in places. The middle path seemed relatively clear, but the air coming from it was cold and carried an odd metallic tang. The right path sloped downward slightly, and faint, eerie whispers seemed to drift from its depths. Mara pointed to the middle path. "That's the way. I remember the cold air. It's from the library's old ventilation system." Alan nodded, but as they started down the middle path, a low, guttural growl erupted from behind them. He turned his flashlight toward the sound and froze. The shadows at the junction were shifting, pulling together to form the creatures. Their glowing red eyes pierced the darkness, and their teeth glinted in the dim light. "Run!" Alan shouted, pulling Mara along with him. They sprinted down the tunnel, their footsteps echoing wildly. The growls grew louder, and the creatures gave chase, their forms flowing like liquid but moving with terrifying speed. Alan fired a shot over his shoulder, the sound deafening in the confined space. The bullet hit one of the creatures, and it recoiled, its form flickering like a dying flame. But it didn't stop. The others surged forward, their mouths opening in silent roars. The cold air grew stronger, and Alan spotted a metal door up ahead. It was slightly ajar, its rusted hinges groaning as it swayed. "There!" he yelled, pushing Mara toward it. They burst through the door and slammed it shut behind them. Alan slid a heavy pipe through the handles to barricade it, just as the creatures slammed against the other side. The door shook violently, and the growls became a chorus of enraged howls. Alan backed away, his breathing ragged, as the metal buckled slightly under the force. Mara grabbed his arm. "We have to keep moving. They'll break through eventually." The room they were in was vast, with high ceilings and rows of dusty shelves filled with ancient books. Cobwebs hung from the corners, and the air was thick with the smell of mold and decay. At the far end of the room, a figure moved. A man hunched over a desk, his back to them. He wore a tattered coat, and his long, wiry hair hung down in unkempt strands. Mara called out, "Archivist, we need your help." The man turned slowly, and Alan's grip on his gun tightened. The archivist's face was pale and gaunt, his eyes sunken but filled with an unsettling intelligence. He looked at them with a mix of curiosity and suspicion, his voice raspy. "You shouldn't be here." "We didn't have a choice," Mara said, stepping forward. She held up the book. We need to translate this. It's the only way to stop the shadows. The archivist's eyes widened when he saw the book. The Book of Veils, he murmured. I thought it was lost. Alan interrupted, his tone urgent. We don't have time for stories. The creatures are outside, and they're going to get in. Can you help us or not? The archivist gestured for them to approach. Bring it here. Mara placed the book on the desk, and the archivist began flipping through its pages with trembling hands. His eyes darted across the text, and he muttered to himself in a language Alan couldn't understand. Alan glanced nervously at the barricaded door, which groaned under the relentless assault of the creatures. What does it say? Mara asked anxiously. The archivist looked up, his expression grave. The barrier that keeps the shadows at bay, it's not just failing. It's been deliberately weakened. Someone is trying to tear it down completely. Why would anyone do that? Alan demanded. Power, the archivist said simply. The shadows promise it to those who serve them. The cult, the keepers of the dark, they've been performing rituals to break the seals that hold the barrier together. If they succeed, the tear between worlds will grow, and the shadows will consume everything. Mara pointed to the map in the book. This shows where the seals are, doesn't it? Can we fix them? The archivist nodded. It's possible, but it won't be easy. The seals must be repaired in a specific order, and each one will require a ritual using the symbols in this book. But be warned, the closer you get to the tear, the more dangerous it will become. The shadows will do everything in their power to stop you. A loud crash interrupted them as the door buckled inward, the pipe bending under the pressure. Alan raised his gun. We don't have time for warnings. Where's the first seal? The archivist grabbed a piece of parchment and scrawled something on it before handing it to Mara. Here. This will guide you, but you'll need to move quickly. The cult won't let you do this without a fight. The door gave way with a deafening screech, and the creatures poured into the library. Alan fired at the nearest one, but the bullet barely slowed it down. Mara grabbed the book and the parchment, and the archivist shouted, "There's a hidden exit behind the shelves. Go now." Alan and Mara ran toward the back of the library, the archivist's voice echoing behind them as he shouted incantations. The shelves trembled, and a faint glow filled the room as the archivist tried to hold the creatures back. Alan shoved a shelf aside, revealing a narrow passageway. He and Mara slipped through, the sounds of the battle fading as they descended deeper into the darkness. Alan glanced at Mara, his jaw tight. If we're gonna fix this, we need to be ready for anything. Mara nodded, clutching the book tightly. Then let's not waste any time. Alan and Mara emerged from the narrow passage into a cavernous underground chamber. The air was thick and oppressive, as if the weight of the shadows above had seeped into the very walls. Flickering torches lined the chamber, their flames struggling to stay alive. Ahead of them stood an ornate stone door, covered in strange symbols that seemed to writhe when looked at too closely. Mara unfolded the parchment the archivist had given her and scanned the hastily scribbled notes. This is it. The first seal is behind that door. Alan approached the door cautiously, his flashlight illuminating the carvings. What's the catch? There's always a catch. As if in answer, a low rumbling sound echoed through the chamber. The shadows along the walls began to ripple and shift, forming twisted figures that clawed their way toward them. Alan cursed under his breath and raised his gun. Guess that's the catch. Mara frantically flipped through the book, her fingers trembling. There's a ritual to open the seal. I just need to. No time for that, Alan shouted, firing at the advancing shadows. The bullets slowed them, but the creatures quickly reformed, their glowing red eyes fixed on him. Mara's voice shook as she read from the book, the ancient words foreign and heavy on her tongue. The symbols on the door glowed faintly, and the rumbling grew louder. The creatures howled, their forms flickering as if the light from the symbols was hurting them. Alan fired again and again, his movements precise, but the shadows kept coming, their numbers growing. Mara, hurry, he yelled, backing closer to the door. I'm trying, she snapped, her voice strained. The words in the book felt alive, twisting in her mind as she struggled to pronounce them. Sweat dripped down her face as the glow from the door intensified. Suddenly, a deafening roar filled the chamber, and the ground shook violently. A massive shadow creature emerged from the far end of the room, its size dwarfing the others. Its form was amorphous, constantly shifting, and its eyes burned brighter than the rest. It let out a guttural sound that reverberated through the chamber, shaking the walls. Alan stared at the creature, his grip on the gun tightening. What in the hell is that? Mara didn't look up, her focus entirely on the book. I don't know, but keep it away from me. The massive creature surged forward, its movements fluid and unnaturally fast. Alan fired at its center, but the bullets passed through it harmlessly. The creature lashed out with a shadowy limb, forcing Alan to dive to the side. The impact shattered one of the torches, plunging part of the chamber into deeper darkness. Mara, Alan called out, scrambling to his feet. Whatever you're doing, do it faster. The symbols on the door pulsed with light as Mara reached the final line of the ritual. Her voice wavered, but she pushed through, her determination overriding her fear. The door groaned and began to shift, stone grinding against stone as it slid open, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling downward. It's open, Mara shouted, slamming the book shut. Let's go. Alan didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed her arm, and they ran toward the staircase as the massive creature let out another roar, its form stretching to block their path. Alan fired at the smaller creatures, clearing a way through, and together they dove down the staircase just as the shadowy limbs swiped where they had stood. The stairs spiraled downward endlessly, the air growing colder with each step. The sounds of the creatures above faded, replaced by an eerie silence. Alan kept his gun ready, his eyes scanning for any movement. Mara clutched the book tightly, her breathing uneven. "What now?" Alan asked, his voice echoing in the narrow space. Mara glanced at the parchment. "The first seal should be at the bottom of these stairs. If we can repair it, it should weaken the shadows and give us a chance to reach the others." "And if we can't?" Alan asked grimly. Mara didn't answer. They finally reached the bottom of the staircase and stepped into a small circular room. In the center stood a stone pedestal, and above it hovered a glowing orb, pulsating with a faint blue light. The walls were covered in the same strange symbols as the door, and the air was heavy with a strange, otherworldly energy. Mara approached the pedestal cautiously, her eyes fixed on the orb. "This is it. The first seal." Alan stood guard at the entrance, his flashlight scanning the shadows. "Let's make it quick. I don't think they're going to stay upstairs for long." Mara opened the book again, flipping to the page marked with a jagged ribbon. She traced the symbols on the page with her finger, comparing them to the ones on the walls. "I need to align the symbols with the words in the book. It's like a puzzle." Alan gritted his teeth. "A puzzle? Great. Just what we need." As Mara began chanting, the orb's light grew brighter, casting eerie shadows across the room. The symbols on the walls shifted, their shapes twisting and turning to match the ones in the book. The energy in the room grew stronger, making the air feel charged. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from above, followed by the distant growls of the creatures. Alan tightened his grip on the gun. "They're coming. I'm almost done," Mara said, her voice rising with urgency. The orb began to vibrate, its light pulsing in time with her words. The ground trembled, and a deep hum filled the room, growing louder with each passing second. The shadows at the entrance flickered, and Alan saw the massive creature descending the staircase. Its eyes burned with rage, and its form seemed even more unstable, as if the light from the orb was tearing it apart. It let out a deafening roar, and Alan fired at it, but the bullets had no effect. "Mara," he shouted. Now would be a really good time. The final word of the ritual left Mara's lips, and the orb exploded with light, filling the room with a blinding brilliance. The creature let out a horrific scream as its form disintegrated, the light tearing it apart piece by piece. The smaller shadows that had begun to pour into the room vanished, consumed by the light. When the glow finally faded, the room was silent. The orb was gone, and in its place was a faintly glowing mark etched into the pedestal. Mara collapsed to her knees, exhausted, and Alan rushed to her side. "Did it work?" he asked, helping her to her feet. Mara nodded weakly. "The first seal is restored. But we're not done yet." Alan looked back toward the staircase, the shadows now gone. "Then let's keep moving. We've got a long way to go." That's the end of the story. If you enjoyed the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more exciting tales. Check out our other videos and share your thoughts in the comments. Stay tuned for the next adventure. Thanks for watching.